Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm your host, Dan Nash, PhD researcher in exercise physiology and 2:15 marathon runner. So welcome back. Thank you for joining me on this 4th episode. I firstly just want to thank those people who listened to the previous episode and gave me feedback. That was fantastic and much appreciated. I'm glad it went down well. And also thank you to those who bought me a coffee. That is very generous of you. It's really appreciated and goes a long way to helping me keep producing content. So if you enjoy this episode, then please do buy me a coffee. There's a link to the app in the show notes. So when thinking about this episode, I put out a couple of ideas on Twitter and ran a poll, and I proposed either to talk about threshold training. Is it worth the current hype that's going around? And I also put out the other option of talking about the different training adaptations we get in high intensity training versus the adaptations we get from low intensity training. So I put out a Twitter poll, and with 114, I think, responses, we got a 50-50 split. So that was quite impressive, tighter than the Brexit vote. So I think thanks very much for everyone who gave the input on that. By about 0.1%, I think it was, the thresholds training topic did win out. But because it was so close and obviously there's interest in both topics, I'll be doing the training adaptations relative to different exercise intensities podcast probably in my next episode, within the next week or two. So don't feel disappointed if you voted for that one. You will hear that episode. It's just we're going to go with the I'll respect the vote and go with the physiology of threshold training and is it worth the hype in this episode today. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about, or I thought this might be a good topic to cover, is because there's a recent paper come out which has got the very catchy title, "Does lactate-guided threshold interval training within a high-volume, low-intensity approach represent the next step in the evolution of distance running training?" Really catchy title, but basically it's a commentary on what's probably more classically known as the Norwegian model of training, which has been popularized primarily by the Ingebrigtsens brothers, most notably Jakob Ingebrigtsen, Olympic champion, not quite world champion. Our own Jake Whiteman got that, but multiple time European medalist and a teenage prodigy. They've been very vocal in sharing their training, and there's a fantastic YouTube series called Team Ingebrigtsen, which really closely follows their training over multiple seasons, and you get a really good insight into their day-to-day training. But they have a slightly unique approach. I don't think it's completely different, as this paper sort of suggesting that maybe it is, but it's certainly different in that they do a lot of threshold training. So they typically do sessions on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Tuesday and Thursday involve a threshold session in the morning, doing 10k worth of volume. So normally 5 by 2k, but from what I understand, and then in the afternoon they'll come back and they'll do another threshold session, again 10k volume, normally slightly shorter reps, so something like 25 times 400 meters or 10 by a k, and they'll do both those double threshold days, as they've been termed, on a Tuesday and a Thursday. And then on Saturday, they'll go and do something a bit harder, so typically 20 times 200 meter hills with a jog back recovery. And then only a sort of moderately long, a long run, but not a super long run compared to other elite athletes. They do 20k, a pretty gentle pace, I think, on the Sunday. So that's where the threshold training bit sits in this title, this threshold interval training. And then in a high volume, the actually important aspect is it's a high volume training program. So they're doing about 190 kilometers a week, or about 110, 115 miles a week. So a high volume of training, but with a lot of threshold work in there. So what is also very notable about their training is that they're very precise with these threshold training sessions. But then they're using lactate measures, so measuring blood lactate, using a portable handheld lactate monitor basically every training session. And I think this very public sharing of what they do, in combination with their results record, especially Jakob's, has made this very popular, and there's been an eruption, or maybe it's just my social media bubble, but on Instagram, I just see athlete after athlete now testing their lactate levels using Lactate Pro, typically, which is a type of brand of lactate monitor, to see what their lactate levels are at the end of the session, and trying to be as precise as they can in controlling the intensity here. So I think this is getting much more, this seems to me definitely become much more prevalent. It's something that I do in as my role as a physiologist with Welsh Athletics and Welsh Triathlon. I monitor training sessions. But I've been doing this for a few years now, but I think in the last year particularly, it really has erupted in just the awareness of the general public, and also the popularity, and people asking more questions about lactate and what actually is threshold training. But I think in regards to that, a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon without maybe understanding actually what the purpose of it is, especially amateur athletes. It's it's expensive to buy a lactate monitor, but actually it's not completely prohibitive. You're talking about 250 odd quid for a monitor, and then a test strip which you use to measure your lactate is about £1.80 a go. So it's not, you can get through the strips, the tests pretty quickly, but it's not we're not talking like £5,000 racing bikes or 10 grand race bikes, whatever, as the costs are often in cycling. So it's not completely prohibitive, which I think again has led to a bit more of hype around the topic of threshold training recently. So that's what I want to delve into today then. Right, threshold training, is it worth the hype? I think there's hype around it. Maybe it's just me, as I said, maybe it's just me in my echo chamber, but I hear a lot about threshold training at the moment. I think that between threshold training and zone 2, that's what I'm hearing a lot of. And today we're going to talk about threshold training. So I'm going to cover what actually is threshold training. I've alluded to it quite a bit on a previous podcast, especially on I think episode 2, where I talk about critical speed. So you go back and listen to that if you're interested, and to go into it and to what actually is threshold training in a bit more detail. But I'll give a bit of a recap of what actually threshold training is. I'll delve into this paper that I just mentioned, which I'll link to that in the show notes. But actually, why may threshold training be important? And I think it's important to say that a lot of why we think it's important is more hunches and well-educated guesses. I don't think we've got I don't think it's completely defined why it may or may not be a useful intensity to train at, but we'll delve into that as we get there. And I'll also talk about some limitations on actually threshold training. Obviously can't tick all the boxes. What can it offer us, and what maybe it can't offer us in terms of training outcomes and training adaptations. So I hope that sounds interesting. If not, turn off now. If that sounds pretty good, then stick around and we'll go through a deep dive into threshold training. So, as I said, we'll start off with what actually is threshold training. So, in terms of what does the threshold bit refer to, we're typically referring to the second threshold, okay, or what people typically refer to as the pace they can sustain for about an hour, like that half marathon pace. That's the sort of intensity that we're talking about here. But as a physiologist, what I mean when I talk about threshold training, we typically think about the highest intensity where we can maintain a metabolic steady state. Now, that metabolic part can refer to multiple different parameters. Now, the Ingebrigtsens think about lactate, but it could be oxygen consumption. It could be other more complicated things that we can measure actually within the muscle itself. But actually, from a practical standpoint, when we're dealing with athletes in the field, we typically talk about lactate. So I'm gonna talk about lactate for the rest of this podcast primarily. But basically, the second threshold is the highest speed or intensity that we can maintain for whilst maintaining a steady metabolic state. So for example, if I was running at 30 minutes on a treadmill, I would expect my lactate levels measured from my blood to be elevated above my resting levels. So resting levels of lactate are about 1 millimole per litre. I'd expect lactate to be elevated a bit, so 3 or 4 millimoles per litre. But if I took it every 5 minutes, I'd expect it to be pretty stable over time. So it might drift very slightly, but there's not going to be a big drift. So for example, I'm running for 30 minutes on a treadmill, and like we'll pretend it's me, and I have my threshold we think is about 19 kilometers an hour. So we confirm this, we go on the treadmill, we take my lactate at 10 minutes, and it's 3.5. We take it at 15 minutes, it's 3.7. We take it at 20 minutes, it's 3.8. Take it at 25 minutes, 3.8. Take it at 30 minutes, 3.9. So we're pretty happy that that's stable effectively. It's not, we've had a very marginal drift, and it seems to have leveled off. And so that is probably below my threshold because things are remaining stable. Now we can confirm that. We could do another run at 19.5k an hour, let's say. And this time my lactate, instead of leveling off at 3.8, it goes after 10 minutes, it's 4. After 15 minutes, it's 4.5. After 20 minutes, it's 5. After 30 minutes, it's 6. Okay, so actually that's evidently not stable anymore. And if we kept going at that intensity, lactate would just keep climbing until I became exhausted. So there'd be no steady state at all. And if we were measuring our oxygen consumption as well during this fictitious treadmill run, then I would probably get to exhaustion when I hit VO2 max. And oxygen consumption would mirror lactate, and that it would just keep climbing over time. Whereas when I was doing that first exercise bout where lactate at 19 kilometers an hour, when lactate stabilized, my oxygen consumption would stabilize. Now this is basically the definition of our maximal metabolic steady state. Our lactate turn point is sometimes referred to as, or we'll just call it for now our threshold, because although there are other thresholds, that's the one we're really interested in this discussion. So our threshold is one that, if you talk to runners, they typically refer to just the threshold. This is one they're talking about, that's highest metabolic steady state, that highest speed they can achieve whilst maintaining a metabolic steady state. So when the Ingebrigtsens are doing their training, they're trying to be either at or just below probably that threshold, because it's a very fine line between just crossing it. If you cross over it a little bit, then you're going to start to see lactate accumulating. But if you're just below it, then you're much more confident that you're going to be exercising at the right intensity. So from my understanding, if we look at what the Ingebrigtsens are doing, they typically report doing their morning sessions. They're like 5x2k, actually at the lower end at about 2 millimole lactate, 2.5 millimole of lactate, and their second session about 3 to 3.5 millimoles of lactate. But most importantly, what they're seeing is what they're not looking for is the absolute values, but that over the course of the session, lactate is remaining stable. Now, they do it slightly differently to what I would say was traditionally been thought of as a threshold run, where you might do 20 to 30 minutes of a steady state pace. The Ingebrigtsens don't do this. They break it up with intervals, but with short recoveries. So they do 5x2K, for example, with a minute recovery. So not long, but this allows them to measure their lactate in between the intervals to make sure they're running at the right intensity. But they can also run slightly faster than maybe they could do if it was a continuous effort, because that recovery period allows a bit of time for recovery, where lactate and other metabolites can be reduced and pulled back to their normal resting values. So basically, breaking it up into intervals allows you to run at a slightly faster speed, but this for the same metabolic cost as a threshold session. So for example, I talked about them doing 25 times 400 meters with 30 seconds recovery as a threshold session. Well, if they measure their lactate over the course of that block, so say they measured it every fifth rep, they're not going to measure it every 25 times. So if they measure every 5 or so intervals, you'd expect lactate to be pretty stable, for them about 3.5 millimole, but they'll be running a lot faster than the pace that they could sustain for about an hour. Typically, apparently they go down to about 10K, maybe slightly inside 10K pace. And from my own experience of trialing this myself with taking lactates, yeah, I'd say that probably between 5K and 10K pace, the sort of speed you can maintain doing that sort of interval session, while lactates are still actually stable over time, because actually those 30-second recovery periods allow you the lactate to be removed. We have we can also store oxygen within our muscles using a protein called myoglobin. So similar to the hemoglobin we have in our bloods, we've got a protein called myoglobin in our muscles, which is basically a mini oxygen store, which can be replenished during those recovery periods. So actually, you can run a bit faster, a bit closer to the specific velocities that you're going to use in training, but for a similar metabolic cost. Now, I hope that makes sense. We're going to talk about actually why that might be advantageous in this next section. So I hope we're all on the same page there in terms of what thresholds, what a threshold is. So what a threshold is. So the highest metabolic steady state. So the highest intensity we can sustain whilst basically all of our body is in a steady state homeostasis. So lactate levels are stable, our oxygen consumption is stable, our heart rate's going to be pretty stable, and our RPE, our rating of perceived exertion, is also going to be reasonably stable. Of course, we're going to get more tired over the course of a session, but every rep shouldn't feel significantly harder than the previous one. And I've also hope you understand how the Ingebrigtsens, because this is sort of what we're talking about here, how they implement their threshold sessions, and so they can use shorter reps to run at the same, at a higher velocity than they would in a continuous run, but for a pretty similar cost in terms of their lactate, their heart rate, their RPE. So why may threshold training be a good intensity to work at? So there's a number of factors that have been proposed. As I said earlier, we definitely don't have definitive answers on why or if threshold training is good. Spoiler, I think it is a useful intensity to work at. And my experimentation with threshold training seems to have produced productive results, seem to do good training adaptations. But obviously, I'm just an N of one. I'm just a single person, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work as well for everybody. And it's certainly not it doesn't constitute a scientific study. but I thought I'd better disclose my biases before I go into talking about why it may be good. But yeah, there's been a number of mechanisms proposed. The first one is how it could be a good stimulus for increasing the amount of mitochondria that we have. So mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells. It's where the location within our cells, the organelles, the mini organs, if you like, that sit within our cells and convert carbohydrates and fats primarily into energy in the form of ATP via aerobic means. So it's the aerobic system. It's basically, when we're talking about aerobic respiration happening within the cell, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about mitochondria. So to put it more simply, if we have more mitochondria within our muscle fibers, then we're going to be better able to burn carbohydrates, fat, and lactate, which we can also use as an energy source. We're going to be better at burning all of these via aerobic metabolism. And that's going to mean we are less reliant on glycolysis, our anaerobic system, for energy production. So it's well established that having more mitochondria is a very beneficial adaptation to get from training. And threshold training has been associated with having more mitochondria. But what's interesting is there's not a linear increase in the amount of stimulus we're getting for more mitochondria production with exercise intensity. And exercise intensity certainly does seem to be important, or one important stimulus for increasing our number of mitochondria. But it's not that actually if we keep increasing the intensity, we get a better stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis, or the creation of new mitochondria. It seems to be that this pathway for mitochondrial production gets saturated quite quickly. So actually we only need to work at a threshold intensity to get as much of a stimulus as we're going to get. So actually if we work closer towards our VO2 max, so that intensity we can sustain for about 6 to 8 minutes, we're not getting any increase in the signal that we're sending to our within our muscle fibers to increase mitochondrial production. So actually there's basically, in other words, no need to work any harder than our thresholds to increase the signal for mitochondrial biogenesis, so increase mitochondrial production. So this is one reason why it's been proposed that threshold training might be beneficial, in that we actually just don't need to work super hard to get those adaptations. And that leads us into a second reason why it's been proposed that threshold training is a useful intensity to work at, in that we fatigue, so we tire 4 times quicker when we're working above our threshold compared to when we're running below our threshold. So actually the fatigue within an exercise bout is a lot lower below our threshold. We can sustain that intensity for a lot longer than if we're operating above the threshold and closer towards VO2 max. So if we link that with a previous point on mitochondria, we can basically make ourselves less tired but still get a really good stimulus, or a great stimulus for mitochondria production, working at a threshold intensity or below the threshold, compared to working right up to VO2 max, which would be a really hard session. So typically I see, when I measure it in the lab, that the threshold normally correlates with about a 7 out of 10 effort in most people. There's a bit of variability there, but I would say it's normally I'd go 7 out of 10 average, but a range of maybe 6 to 8, sometimes 9 out of 10, and if you're very well trained. But actually I think the key takeaway there is you don't need to be working really, really hard to get a complete stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis. Linked to that notion of fatigue and that we fatigue slower below the threshold, this also allows us to accumulate much more volume in our interval sessions. So a typical VO2 max session, so a high intensity session, where we're trying to get our oxygen consumption all the way up to its max values, which basically means we're trying to get our heart rate as close to max as we can. That might be, 3 to 4 times 4 minutes with 3 minutes recovery, pretty much the best speed you can maintain for that, those 4 minute efforts. Okay, so you only can really accumulate about 16 minutes of work if you're really motivated at an intensity that's pretty close to VO2 max. You might not be quite there, but you're going to be pretty close. And by the end of the session, you're definitely going to be, right up to VO2 max. But if we limit our intensity to something that's more akin to where the threshold is or just below it, then we can do actually much bigger sessions. So instead of doing 4 by 4 minutes at VO2 max intensity, we might be able to do 6 by 5 minutes, even up to 10 by 5 minutes or more, as long as we keep the intensity under control. And I think examples of something similar could be taken from what Eliud Kipchoge does in his fartlek sessions, which he seems to do each week, where they're doing a fartlek that's over an hour long, and it could be 5 minutes on, 2 minutes off, or sometimes it's a minute on, minute off. But just because of the duration of those training sessions, they must be working just below their threshold. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be able to do it. But I think that's indicative of actually, if you're just below your threshold, you can do a lot of work there without becoming extremely fatigued, which is going to impact on that next day's training session, because I think the goal of any training program should be that it's sustainable for a long time. And actually, that means that you probably shouldn't be getting to the point where you're so tired that you can never complete the training that's planned for the next day, the day after that, and the day after that. So actually, that might be a good way, or another mechanism in which threshold training is important, in that it limits the fatigue that we're going to get for the subsequent training bouts. And this is, I think this is definitely a consideration in how the Ingebrigtsens are structuring their training, because they could do 20 kilometers of threshold work just in the morning and then go for a jog in the afternoon. But actually they split it up, they spread it out to make it much more manageable. So actually they're doing 20 kilometers of threshold work over the course of the day, but it becomes much more manageable if we do 10 kilometers of work in the morning and 10 kilometers work in the afternoon, because they're going to have a period during the day where they can recover, they can replete their glycogen stores, get hydrated, rehydrated, etc. And they're going to be able to then perform another good quality session in the afternoon without leaving them so fatigued, because they've in 48 hours time they've got to do a whole thing again. So you need to be able to be in a position to do that by paying really close attention to the intensity control. That might have been a slight tangent there. I'm not quite sure. I've lost track a little bit. But I've basically got one more hypothesis, proposal for why threshold training might be a useful intensity to work at. And that is that when we're running at a low intensity, so below our first lactate threshold, so a pace we could sustain for about 3 hours or so a pretty comfortable intensity, we're not actually using all of our muscle. So we have multiple, our muscle is made up of hundreds and hundreds of muscle fibers. And I'm sure you're aware that we have muscle fibers that are more slow twitch, so they're more fatigue resistant, they're better aerobic metabolism. And we've got muscle fibers that are more fast twitch, so they're great at producing lots of force, and they're very strong, but they're a bit more fatigable. Now, when we're running at an easy pace, what we do is we don't use our whole muscle to run at that pace and just make them contract less. What we do is that we just recruit the muscle fibers that we need to generate the force required to run at an easy pace. And we actually cycle between these slow twitch muscle fibers so that they can have a bit of a break and a bit of a recovery period before they need to be used again. But as we start to run faster, we start to recruit more of those muscle fibers simultaneously, so that now we get up to threshold when we're going to start using the fast twitch fibers now. We can't just rely on the slow twitch fibers to produce the force we need to run at a given pace. We now need to use some of those fast twitch fibers as well. Now, if we continue this all the way up to sprinting, that's sort of an intensity where you're going to be using all of your muscle fibers simultaneously. So all of your fast twitch fibers and all of your slow twitch fibers. Now, I hope you're following me here, but basically the concept is that we're not just using all of our muscle all the time. We're only using certain muscle fibers depending on the intensity that we run at. Now, when we're running at a threshold intensity, we're going to start to use the fast twitch fibers, and we're probably going to be using quite a lot of them, and we may well be cycling between the fibers, which ones are getting used and recruited. But importantly, at threshold intensity, we're probably using a pretty high percentage of all of our muscle fibers to produce the force we need to run at velocities that are associated with the threshold. And this is important because actually we can only get training adaptations in the muscle fibers that we recruit. So we're not going to train our fast twitch fibers, for example, by just jogging around and doing low intensity training. So that means that, of course, we need some sort of intensity within the program if we want to train those fast twitch fibers. Because although most endurance runners, especially those people who are naturally inclined to endurance running and seem to be successful at endurance running, have a high proportion of slow twitch fibers, they could still easily have 20% fast twitch, and actually in the middle distance athletes, they might be 50% fast twitch. Now, it probably doesn't really matter, but I think the lesson here is that everybody's got some fast twitch fibers, and so we're going to need to do some sort of high intensity training to stimulate adaptations in those fibers. So those mitochondrial adaptations that I was mentioning earlier, we're only going to get those adaptations in the fibers that we recruit. And the proposal is that threshold training may be an effective way of recruiting actually a good proportion of our fast twitch fibers without the fatigue of going at higher intensities closer to VO2 max, which are going to have knock-on effects and a longer recovery time in terms of the days needed to recover from that session compared to a more threshold-based session. Now, again, that's quite speculative, but it's mentioned in this review article, this paper that I'm not going to repeat the title because it was so bloody long. But I said in the show notes, but basically this is one of the hypotheses, is that it's recruiting fast twitch fibers, and so can cause training adaptations and aerobic training adaptations in these fibers without the fatigue that's associated with really high intensity work, so close to VO2 max, so about 4x4 minutes session that I spoke about earlier. So they're all the good bits, but I think all the good proposals that have been suggested for why threshold training may be a really useful intensity to sit at and to train at regularly. But there's obviously limitations with training at the threshold as well. which I'm gonna go through now, potentially with some counter arguments along the way, because I do think there's a big value in training at the threshold, but obviously we can't train at the threshold all the time. So first limitation is actually the mechanical output. So although we seem to be getting really good aerobic adaptations from doing threshold training, so the mitochondrial adaptations that I spoke about earlier, as well as lots of others, which I think we haven't got time to go through today, and I think it's actually quite controversial in terms of we aren't very good at knowing, and I still don't think as a scientific community we really know what the adaptations we're getting from a given training intensity. Again, I'm going from a tangent here, but basically we know we can get good aerobic adaptations from doing threshold work, but actually most people are racing at speeds that are quite a lot higher than the threshold. Certainly, in terms of if we're running at 5K, at 10K, if we talk about the Olympic distances, the 10K, the 5K, the 1500 meters, the 800 meters, the steeplechase, the race walks, these are all occurring at intensities quite a bit higher than where the threshold is. And although we can get a good aerobic adaptations from training at the threshold, we're not getting the specific mechanical stimulus which we're going to need when we're running at competition velocities. And this could be important for things such as running economy. There's evidence to suggest that you become most economical, most efficient at the paces that you train at. So actually, if you never train at race pace, then actually you might not be quite as economical and efficient as you could be when you're running at those velocities. And certainly in running, our biomechanics do change as we go from a slow pace all the way up to a fast pace, and so it makes sense that you want to be reasonably familiar with the actual speeds that we're going to be running at, racing at, when we're competing in those shorter events that are happening well above the thresholds. Now, I've already mentioned that the Ingebrigtsens get around this by breaking it up into shorter intervals. So 400 meters, for example, with 30 seconds recovery is a classic session that's been ascribed to the Ingebrigtsens. And in this paper, linked to in the show notes, the authors say that they've witnessed athletes running 400 meter intervals in 64 seconds with a lactate that's under 4 millimole, with a very short recovery period. And that's very fast, like 64 seconds, 2 minutes 40 per kilometer, about 420 per mile pace, like with a lactate that's under 4 millimole is very impressive. But in the case of Jakob Ingebrigtsen, 64 seconds is 13:20 5-kilometer pace. Well, he's run under, I think he's run about 12 minutes 40. So even then, it's still a bit slower than his specific race pace. Now, what they could do is they could run, for example, instead of doing 400 meter intervals, they could do 200 meter intervals or even 100 meter intervals with very short recoveries. And that might allow them to run even a little bit faster again, but for the same metabolic cost. Now, they don't do that, and maybe there's a good reason they don't do that. Maybe they've experimented with that and they found that actually, although they're aerobically not being taxed as much as it's a VO2 max session, maybe the force outputs are so high that they're getting actually a lot of muscular fatigue. And having practiced this type of training, I would say that doing 25 times 400 with 30 seconds recovery is harder than doing 5 by 2K off a minute recovery even though the lactates might be the same. And I think that's because the mechanical output is obviously higher when you're running 400 meters at a threshold intensity compared to running the 2K. Like for example, I would say that for me, if I was running at about 3.5 millimole and I'm fit, I could be doing the 2Ks or like the 6 minute efforts at about 5 minute mile pace, with my lactates being under control, which is 74.5 seconds before 100. But I would be running the 400s. If I was doing 25 by 400, I could be running them in 70 seconds per lap with a lactate of about 3.5 millimole. And that's, 70 seconds is about 440 a mile, 255 a K. So we're talking about 10 seconds a K or 20 seconds a mile faster doing the 400 meters versus doing the longer 6 minute efforts. And so actually that, although metabolically they're quite similar, I'm working at the same intensity, mechanically it feels quite a lot harder running at those 400 meters compared to the longer efforts. Now I hope you're following me and that makes sense, but I think that basically a limitation of threshold work is that we're not getting the specific mechanical stimulus that we're going to encounter in the race, even by including shorter intervals. So that probably means that we can't just do threshold training all year round and expect to then race a really good 5K. We're probably going to need to do some stuff that is more specific. And we see that in the Ingebrigtsen's training approach, that they have a very threshold dominant training program. But as they get to race season, when they're running 1500 meters, 3Ks, 5Ks, they then go into more classical specific work running at the speeds they expect to encounter in the race. So they might still do 400 meter intervals, but they might reduce the number down to 15. They might give themselves, instead of 30 seconds recovery, they might give themselves a minute, 75 seconds recovery, and they'll run them faster. Because now they're not really so bothered about the lactate response. They're more, because when they're running a 5K, your lactate levels are not going to be under control. They're going to be very high. So what they're more worried about is running at the specific velocities that they think they're going to sustain for the race period. So we see that in Mohavi Ingebrigtsen's approach. Now, they also don't just suddenly go from doing threshold work to doing loads of high intensity training. They are doing some form of higher intensity training every week of the year, but in a base period, this typically looks like 200 meter hill reps. So although obviously they're going up a hill, and so they're not going to have the same, they're not going to be running at the same velocities as they would be doing on the flat, so it won't be quite as fast as they'll be running in their 1500 meters and their 5K races. They will have a similar lactate response, and the force outputs will be just as high in terms of their muscle fiber recruitment and the amount of force that they're generating. And actually, you can generate more force running up a hill than you can on the flat. So maybe this is probably a way that they can prepare themselves for the faster work they're going to do into the summer without really fatiguing them, because they're keeping them to short intervals, just effectively 30-second hill reps with generous recoveries. So they're getting some sort of high intensity that's closer to VO2 max, but they're only really spicing it in the program. It's not a dominant feature, I would say. But I think if you're thinking of introducing a threshold model of training, then I do think it's important to still include a little bit of high intensity work in there. And that brings me on to my second point, in that threshold training isn't going to give you even all the physiological adaptations that you need to be a complete distance runner. And there are specific adaptations that you're going to get from working above the threshold as well. So for example, it's commonly thought that actually if you want to improve your VO2 max, you need to be training above 90% of your VO2 max to get a good stimulus for adaptation. So actually you need to have your heart rate pretty close to your max. It doesn't need to be right at your max, but it needs to be reasonably close to be able to really stimulate the cardiovascular adaptations that lead to an improvement of VO2 max. But for most people, that's going to be quite a bit above their threshold. And so actually, although threshold training may influence your VO2 max up to a point, especially if you're not that well trained, you're probably not going to get a big improvement in your VO2 max through just doing threshold training. Now, we can argue whether that's important or not. VO2 max, whether you need to improve your VO2 max is probably very much down to the individual. What is your VO2 max already high enough? What event are you training for? Are you training for the marathon? Are you training for the 5K? That's going to, as I talked about in the last podcast in episode 3, that's going to be very individual for you. But I think the key message here is we can't get all of the training adaptations from just doing threshold training alone. And I think another limitation to threshold training is that actually, as I've talked about right at the very intro, to do it well and be really precise, you need to have a good idea of where your threshold is. And the Ingebrigtsens place so much emphasis on this that they're taking lactates during every single session. Now, you can probably get away with not doing that. That's probably that detail probably is not needed unless you are trying to win an Olympic gold. But I do think that it is difficult to precisely get an idea of where your threshold is without at least having a measurement of some point of your lactate threshold, probably in a lab setting, and then getting some heart rates that correlate to that lactate, to that threshold. Now, you can go off race paces, of course you can, but things such as the environment, the terrain you're running on, the environmental conditions, it's hot, is it cold, all of these things can affect the speed that you're going to be able to run these sessions at. And I think it's actually much easier for someone who's been training for a long time to get a natural feel of where their threshold is at relative to someone who's not been running that long and doesn't have as much experience with gauging their efforts. So I think that's certainly one limit, is a practical limit of actually how do you know if you're at your threshold or not. And is it, another question we don't really know is how crucial is it that we are, exactly at our threshold, just below our threshold, there's above our threshold. We know that we'd expect slightly different adaptations and slightly different responses. As I said, we fatigue quicker if we're above our threshold, but actually if we're just slightly above, does it matter that much? In the grand scheme of things, probably not. If we're really trying to optimize, then yes. In the case of the Ingebrigtsens, we probably need to have quite tight control, but for general principles, I think just going off of your RPE, so your rating of perceived exertion, is probably a pretty effective way of conducting a threshold session. So going back to what I said previously with our threshold in the lab, threshold normally comes out about a 7 out of 10 effort for most people. My advice would be, if you want to try threshold training and you haven't been tested in the lab or haven't got access to a lactate meter, then I would just look to cap all of your sessions at a 7 out of 10 effort if the purpose is developing your threshold. or to work at threshold or just below your threshold intensity. So if you're going for a 7 out of 10 effort, it's probably going to be a pretty good gauge of whether you're working at your threshold or not. And even if you're slightly above, if the effort is only 7 out of 10, then you're probably going to get a good stimulus of adaptation, because 7 out of 10, you're not jogging around, you're working pretty hard, but it's also not going to leave you super fatigued the next day, hopefully, and you should be ready to do your next hard session, whether that be is in 2 days time, 3 days time, whatever. So in that regard, maybe you are actually, even if you're just going with RPE, maybe you're getting the benefits of certainly why a lot of these authors think that threshold training is beneficial, in that you are stimulating a level of adaptation, but without becoming excessively tired. So I think that the vast majority of people can get away with just being honest with themselves, making sure that they have control within their sessions, and that every session doesn't become a race. And I think that's the sort of the key takeaway with threshold training, is that actually we don't exactly know why it's beneficial. I would say the anecdotal evidence suggests that it is, in terms of the athletes that are using this type of training. And I think there's emerging scientific research to support threshold training. But in my eyes at least, it boils down to that simple fact that actually we don't want to be working 10 out of 10 efforts every single day, because that's not sustainable. We probably want to be touching a 7 out of 10 effort 2 or 3 times a week, and mixing up with some higher intensity work periodically. But if we're going, 7 out of 10 2 or 3 times a week, maybe once a week, once a fortnight, we're going to an 8 or 9 out of 10, running using short intervals to run a little bit faster, and combining that with lots of low intensity work, because I think people think of the Ingebrigtsens, for example, and they go, they're doing loads of threshold, that's why they're good. Yes, they're doing loads of threshold, but they're also running 190 kilometers or 115, 110 miles per week. So a lot of their training is very easy still. And that's probably another major reason why they are some of the best athletes in the world, especially Jakob. Sorry, that was me trying to wrap it up, but I went off on another tangent about easy volume. But I think it's definitely important to mention that threshold training is only one component of what should be a well-rounded training program. So I'll wrap that up there. I hope that's been interesting. As I said at the beginning, if you have found this content interesting, do let me know. I appreciate the feedback. If you have got the capacity and you would like to help support me producing more content, then visit my Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, because that is really appreciated. And in the next episode, I'll cover that second, the runner-up in my Twitter poll, which was looking at the training adaptations in high intensity versus low intensity training. I think it'll be a nice carry on from what we've talked about today, and I think it's we've sort of laid the foundations here, and I've alluded to some of those differences, but we can go into a bit more detail. I think specifically talking about the low intensity stuff, we talked a bit about the high intensity, but actually why is low intensity in training really important? So yeah, if that sounds interesting, check out my next podcast, which should be out in the next couple of weeks. I'm not going to put a date on it because I'm super busy and I don't want the pressure, but I promise that these podcasts will just keep coming. So thanks for listening. Have a great week of training, and take care.